What is the solution to the educational morass in which we find ourselves? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled case on the really major issues of the day. And I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel, who I think is on vacation now, Richard. Is that right?
Yeah, sort of, but I have work to do, and an economist's work is never done fighting for truth, justice, and the free market way.
Well, no, what I meant was that you're a professor and therefore you're always on vacation.
Okay, viewers and listeners, once again, you see what I have to put up with for decades now, not just years, but decades. I've tried to smooth out his rough edges, but it seems to no good.
Okay, Richard. Well, while we're on the subject of education, it's been a while since we addressed the concept of public schooling. And I thought it's good to revisit it because it is really one of the most important issues of our time. I think it's the root cause of most of the problems we face in this country. If people could ever break free of the indoctrination that they receive in the public government schooling system, we would have a shot at really moving this country in a freer direction. And the other reason it popped into my mind about addressing it during Libertarian Angles, I got an email from a guy that said, "Oh, so you would have only the rich people get their kids educated. Is that it?" And so you've got these myths and delusions that with respect to freedom of education that I thought, well, let's come back and revisit the area. As you know, Richard, we've got a fantastic book at FFF. I think it's the best book on this subject around, and that's Separating School and State: How to Liberate America's Families by Sheldon Richman. And so if anybody wants to delve further into this subject, that's what I would recommend. But let me just start out with basics, Richard. We've got a system where the state mandates education and in fact controls education. Now it's divided into a public school system. We call it public, but really it's government schools. And then you got private schools, but even those fall under the control of the government under licensure laws. You don't get a license, you don't run a private school. And then you've got homeschooling, but in most states, the state is controlling that as well. That you have to submit your curriculum and you have to pass certain tests and so forth. And so that the state really does control the educational system. And the question is why? I mean, what business does the state have providing or mandating education? We all know the state produces the worst of everything. I mean, take a look around you. Anything the state does, it does poorly. And so here is something that is a commodity, a product that is arguably the most important part of people's lives. Well, second, I guess, to food and housing. But I mean, education, this is what makes a person in many instances. Why would you want to entrust that to the state? On the other hand, the free market produces the best of everything. We see that. We see it in computers and cars and all kinds of different products. Why not freedom of the free market with respect to education as well? Now, what would that entail? That would entail a repeal of compulsory attendance laws. Those are laws where the state requires parents to send their kids into this government institution. And most of them, let's face it, pick the public school alternative. And it would mean the repeal of school taxes, no more forcing people to fund education through taxation, the selling off of the school buildings or donating them to some cause. In other words, the total end of all state involvement in education. And the analogy I have used over the years is religion. That we don't have the state involved with religion. We've developed a tolerance on how people raise their children with respect to religion. Some people take their kids to church, other people don't. And people have come to accept that as just, hey, that's the way it is. People raise their families differently. Why not the same in education? In a free market, each family would be making these determinations. You would have the market flooded with educational vehicles, products, ways of teaching by entrepreneurs that are making money. And you'd also have amelioration organizations providing education to the poor for free, like we see with churches. Nobody charges the poor to go to church. So my argument, Richard, is why are so many, my question is, why are so many people still so wedded to this antiquated system of public schooling? And my hunch is that the answer is because they're a product of public schooling, and therefore being subject to the indoctrination there, they still believe in it. What do you think?
Well, I think that you hit the nail on the head with this last point, is that I think that to a great extent, the reason why too many of our fellow Americans find it difficult to conceive of a privatized educational system, because that's all they've known. The fact is that they went to public schools in the vast majority of cases. Their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, all the way back as long as they've had ancestors in the United States. The educational system began to be advocated as a public institution, a formal and mandatory system, beginning in the middle of the 19th century. And the original idea behind it was that it was necessary to homogenize all of these different immigrant groups for there to be a recognized and distinct and separate American sense of identity, values, purpose, and loyalty. So it's basically, so these waves of immigrants come in and we indoctrinate them, we mold them, we fill their minds with an official view of what it is to be an American. And to do that, obviously, you have to read, you have to be able to write, you often have to know arithmetic, so those basic essentials, but the entire means and methods of these are for the purpose of indoctrinating. And that's what we've had ever since. Now, the image of what should be taught has changed. As I've mentioned before, when I was a young boy going to government schools, and you took your history class about the beginning of America, going back to Christopher Columbus. Columbus was a hero. He had crossed the Atlantic on his little boats, thinking he was discovering India or finding a route to India. Instead, he bumps into the Western Hemisphere, North America and the Caribbean. And his doing that resulted into the building of a new world, of which the United States was his major component. And then there's always the images of America as an industrial country, and the pictures in the history books, the high school and grammar school history books, with the smokestacks and the smoke coming out of the industrial facilities and the railroads and the highways. By golly, I'm proud to be an American due to Christopher Columbus landing here and America becoming the great economic and industrial giant. Now, fast forward to today. In the same mandatory schools, there's a new line of indoctrination with some exaggeration, but not too much, I don't think. Christopher Columbus was a bad man. He brought diseases to these happy little idyllic natives who were having a wonderful life, if not touched by the corrupt and diseased and harmful effects of European civilization. And then they conquered this new world and made a terrible place of injustice and hardship and exploitation and polluting the air with their smokestacks. Now, what the party line is has changed. But the idea that there is or should be a party line to which all young men and women should be inculcated and indoctrinated in, to hold a common view of their society, of their country, of their government, remains the same. Now, all of this is the reason why we see these conflicts in schools. Viewers and listeners will remember that there used to be, not too long ago, these big controversies at state and local school levels. Shall it just be evolution or creationism? Shall it be Darwin or shall it be the book of Genesis in the Bible? And this became a great fight in communities. Why? Because it's a monopoly school and all children have to attend them. And unless you could afford, which not everyone can, given their incomes and the taxes then taken from that income, to be able to afford a double tuition beyond their taxes to send their kid to a private school, you're stuck sending your kid to that school. So what do you want your child to learn? Do you want them to learn Darwinism or creationism, depending upon your basis or premises? And either the people who hold the opposite view have monopoly control of the curriculum, or your side has control of the curriculum. Shall young girls and boys in grammar school begin the day by saluting the flag and saying the Pledge of Allegiance? Yes or no? Mandatory. It's either what we want or what they want. And now the entire issue that has arisen with this idea of wokeism that is in being embedded in schools. Now, our viewers and listeners who have heard our previous videos in this show, or perhaps have read some of my articles on the FFF site and other sites, know that I'm adamantly against what is basically a rebottled version of Marxism, of class conflict turned into race and gender conflict. This is what wokeism is about. I have no sympathy for this. In fact, quite the opposite. But what we see today is a battle over the control of the schools. Shall those who believe in this new interpretation of the evil of America and the exploitation of women and all people of color by the evil white male capitalists? Or shall it be a more traditional interpretation of American history, even with admitting the warts and pimples? Now, again, shall we control the curriculum and the Board of Education, or will they control the Board of Education? Take the state of Florida right now. You read these articles in the press, wokeism was getting spread in the school system in Florida. What was the response of the governor? The governor's response was, we're going to have the legislature say that this cannot be taught, and then we're going to put what we consider to be the right curriculum and message to be taught. But this is just saying it's either us or them again. All of this arises for one reason alone, because the government controls it, the government funds it, the government supplies it, the government determines the content, and you cannot not send your child to one of these schools unless you can afford a private school, which, as you point out, involves degrees of government control because of licensing and certification and so on. But the fact is that this will never end as long as this is a monopoly institution, a government school, a socialized institution. It's basically socialist education. With either they have the central planning of what's taught and how, or you have the central planning of what's taught and how. The only solution to this, the only answer to this, is the separation of schooling and the state, to get the government out of this. And just, I'll finish with where I was piggybacking on you, Jacob. Why is there this indoctrination and this presumption of we have to have public schools? Because people have been educated in it. The analogy that I like to use, that let us suppose that 100 years ago, the United States government had nationalized the shoe industry. And all shoes were now planned and distributed to people by the government. And now someone like you or myself made a public statement, why is the government in the shoe business? Why can't we have private enterprise in shoes? What would be the response? Oh, you think only rich people should have shoes to wear? Oh, what if parents are irresponsible and as their little kids' feet are growing, they don't want to spend money that should be spent on the next larger size of shoes? No, unless government assures the supply and distributes them and guarantees that everyone gets the shoes that they need. And let's not forget certain forms of affirmative action in shoe provision. There'll be no shoes for those who are in most need of them. Now, we consider this ludicrous because the government isn't in the shoe business. People buy their own shoes, styles, shapes, sizes, different occasions, different price ranges. And we don't even think about it. But we don't think about education this way because we have been indoctrinated over generations to think that if the government doesn't provide it, it will not be provided. And that is just ludicrous. And that is part of the mindset that we have to have people to begin to overcome.
Yeah, you raise a lot of good points there. On your point about, what they're teaching in public schools and how it creates controversy. the ideal of a free market is that you don't have these controversies, that you've got, let's say, a school that's teaching first graders sexual related matters, and there's parents who object. All they have to do is select a different school where the policy is completely different. They don't have to have a election for school board and politicking. We're going to get our people in there and fights and battles. No, you just vote with your feet. You just go over to another school. And so everything's depoliticized. It's like with religion. Okay, there's big differences in religion in this country, obviously. Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, Jews, whatever. Everybody just selects out the vehicle that he feels most comfortable with. You don't see any of these big battles and fights and personal vendettas and so forth. And then your point about indoctrination is so powerful that, I mentioned our book, Separating School and State. And in that book, Sheldon makes the argument that public schools really are not a failure. I mean, we look around the country, and I think everybody recognizes that the system's a failure. Even the defenders of public school think it's a failure because they're always trying to come up with a reform plan to fix it. Sheldon's argument was, no, it's actually been a big success because of its mission. Its mission is to indoctrinate, to create the good little citizen, the one that defers to authority. And we see this time and time again, especially with respect to foreign policy, that whatever the government pronounces, that's the way the populace goes. And they don't know that they've been indoctrinated. They think they're exercising this independent mind of, oh, I'll support the troops, but it's just this knee-jerk reaction. Support the troops. You saw it with respect to the invasion of Iraq. Here was a classic, pure war of aggression. I mean, it's illegal. There's no declaration of war by Congress, is required by the Constitution. But masses of people, as soon as Bush commits the troops to battle, well, okay, debate. We've already had freedom of speech. We've already had support the troops, thank the troops for their service. That's public schooling. That's the power of indoctrination. Richard, you recall that many years ago, that little kid Elian was here in the United States. His mother had brought him over, but his father was Cuban, and the Cuban courts had declared that he rightfully belonged to the father. Father had custody. And there was a big court battle here. And everybody understood what the stakes were, that wherever this kid gets educated, because they got public schooling in Cuba too, whatever state ends up educating him, that's what the kid's going to end up believing. And so the father won, the kid got sent to Cuba. And I recall reading an article a while back, I think the guy's in his 20s now or so, but he's a firm believer in the communist system. Well, that's a product of indoctrination. I remember when I was visiting Cuba many years ago, 10 or so years ago, that I was in the museum that dealt with U.S. interventionism there. And they were teaching, there was a public school class there. The teacher was teaching the students all the little exhibits. And I went over there just to overhear this. And she was talking about the CIA and lambasting the CIA for what it had done on the Bay of Pigs and so forth. And rightly so. But all these kids, of course, were listening intently. Now, over here, if the kids got sent over to a CIA museum or the spy museum in Washington, it'd be a totally different thing. The CIA was battling for freedom when they tried to assassinate Fidel Castro, and they were justified in doing that because he was a communist, and they had to invade the Bay of Pigs to protect America. And everybody, all the kids would be there nodding their heads and carrying it all the way through their adulthood. So I think that's probably the soundest argument to get rid of the system, is that people get their minds encrusted with inches of indoctrination, and we don't even know it. I didn't know it. I mean, I went through this system and I was a subject of indoctrination. And I tell you, Richard, that when I discovered libertarianism, it was just the most phenomenal thing I've ever seen. I mean, I went into the public library of Laredo, Texas. I was in my late 20s. I see these 4 little books, different colored books, and I pull volume 1 off the shelf. There was 4 volumes, and I start reading this thing, and this was hardcore, pure, no compromise, principled, FFF kind of material. And it cracked the indoctrination, the inches of indoctrination. I could just see it cracking, and I could see reality for what it was. As I took these books home and I poured over them and I started learning more about libertarianism, I realized how badly I'd been lied to in public schools and all the nonsense I had learned. And that's what I yearn for in this country, that wall of indoctrination starts cracking apart, and you have this resurgence of conscience where people are responding to the dictates of their conscience, where they're passionate about understanding the way life really is. They don't want to believe the lies that were part of that indoctrination. And if that day ever comes, one of those great awakenings you see about in history, that would be an interesting time to live in, Richard.
Yeah, the other element of this is that competitive private schooling permits the diversity that diversity advocates try to bandy about. But here would be the diversity of ideas, the diversity of ideas. As you were saying, you don't want your kid to learn something in school because you find it morally wrong or inappropriate. You just send your kid to a different school. So there'd be different learnings, different curricula, different methods of learning, pedagogy. And then but what about what about if there are just white schools or black schools or Hispanic schools? Well, the first issue really is, who cares if it's a matter of freedom of choice? The current dilemma that we've had mandatory segregation, mandatory integration, and now mandatory segregation again. In the Old South, there was black and white schools imposed by the state, when in fact many people would not have had this. Then you had, after the mid-1960s and those civil rights laws, mandatory integration. Students are being bused to other parts of entire school districts or different school districts with hours on these buses to try to have some type of proportionality in the students in classrooms in terms of how they look. Now that the wheel has turned again. And now what you see is, people have to have an identity and not feel that they're in a hostile environment. So you now find, clubs that are based upon race or gender, graduations, both in the high school and the college level, based upon race and gender, in which this is now following the circle again. The point is, let people interact how they want, with whom they want. Do you always agree with the benchmarks that people use for these things? Of course not. But what is the ethical and moral and just right way to get people to change what they're doing if you think it's a wrong path? Reason, persuasion, argument, the example of your own life. When people learn on that basis, it is more likely to be accepted and stay with them and then affect them. But when you try to force something down people's throats against their will, against their resistance, too many people just dig in their heels, and you make the problem that you want to ameliorate even worse. Anyone who remembers the forced integration in South Boston back in the 1960s, even if a lot of those Irish communities were racist, to force them in the opposite direction resulted in them digging their heels in, and the racial tension was exacerbated and lasted a lot longer, in my humble opinion, than would otherwise have been the case if you had just gotten government out of the way.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out that the people that pay the biggest price for this system are the poor, the inner city people.
Yes.
They can't afford the nice private schools, and so a lot of these inner city schools are just cesspools of drugs and violence. And it says nothing about the teachers. I mean, let me emphasize this. This is not the teacher's fault. My sister was a public school teacher. Her daughter, my niece was a public school teacher. These are very dedicated people usually, but they're in a bad system. When you've got a bad system and good people, the system's going to win out every single time. And so the best thing that could ever happen to the poor is a free market in education where they can establish their own. Now, people say, oh, well, what about the poor? How would they get an education? Well, look at churches. You don't mandate people having to go to church, or that or let in the poor to church. The poor have plenty of churches to go to. In fact, I've never heard of a church that denies admission to the poor or to anybody because they don't want to pay. It's because people fund churches, wealthier people, middle-class people, and they say, great, we want to fund the poor too. This is an important area. And the same thing would happen in education. It's just that we've lost that faith and freedom. And so it's hard to see it. We all have grown up with this system based on coercion, but wealthier and middle-class people would provide the scholarships or the schools for the poor, simply because they believe it. They think that this is the right thing to do. They want to help out those in need. We also have to remember that education is a seeking process. It's not a cramming process. That when a poor kid wants to learn something and he's passionate about something, he's going to really do everything he can to learn. He's going to ask his parents to get him books at the library or something on some subject he's interested in. And the problem with the whole public school model is it's a cramming system. So you're not really encouraged to learn. You're encouraged to memorize, to regurgitate on their tests what they want you to say. And so a lot of the kids are led astray. I think the essence of life is finding out who you are, what you were born to do, what your talents are, what your abilities are, and whatever that happens to be, become the best of it, and the best parent or the best scientist or whatever. And I think that really can come about through self-education that is being nurtured by the teacher. So the teacher's encouraging you and providing guidance and so forth. But that's what a free market in education would do, where you seek out the best vehicle that nurtures the particular interests of each child. I also want to, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I just want to finish. Well, I did want to shift gears there. So go ahead.
Yeah, just one other thing about, arousing an interest or an enthusiasm among students. If we include in this college students as well as, the grade schools, there's been a whole bunch of data coming out on the precipitous fall in attendance at both junior colleges and at regular colleges and universities. Many people are shunning this. The enrollments are down. Now, part of this is the fact that the US is an aging population because people are having fewer children, if any children. Our natural rate of population growth is almost, if it wasn't for immigrants, almost below reproduction. But the fact is that people who are of college age are now choosing not to go to college. Now, part of it is the cost, which itself has been fed by the government funding of it, which would be another element in the story. But I think a large part of it, when some of the things I read, is that people are finding it a waste of time. Not because there aren't things that they could learn that would be professionally or personally of interest to them, but they're just tired of the indoctrination mills. You go into these places and everything has become politically correct, woke, pushing things down your throat, implicit censorship, intimidation of fear of opening your mouth. So why bother putting yourself in that type of an environment for a junior college for 2 years or a regular college and university for 4 years, as opposed to just going out and getting a job and start earning a living and not being surrounded with this expensive waste of time that you find personally intimidating and disagreeable. So I think that as long as the state is involved in this, from kindergarten through the PhD, we will never escape all of these problems with the quality of education, the content of education, the enthusiasm for learning that we now suffer from.
Yeah, because they destroy the joy of learning. I mean, that was one of the things I learned about libertarianism, that when I discovered libertarianism, I rediscovered my passion for learning that I had had when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I loved to read. But when I went into public school system, I learned that reading does not reward you in public schools. What rewards you is good grades. And so if you orient toward the grades, memorize, do your homework and so forth, you forget the reading, because the reading is not going to get you anywhere. And so when I discovered libertarianism, I rediscovered that joy of just learning that I was voraciously reading everything I could find because I was interested in this subject. Let me shift gears here. I know we're almost out of time, but I think it's worth mentioning that there's a lot of advocates of vouchers, especially in the conservative movement, but even there are some libertarians that have long adhered to vouchers. And this is just, as we've said from the very beginning, another socialist program. It's based on the same principle as public schooling. It uses taxation, the force of taxation, to take money from one person and give it to another person to help fund his education. And it's not in any way conceivable the type of system that you and I are advocating. We're advocating a separation of school and state, like our ancestors separated church and state. Imagine if we had a public churching system and somebody comes along and says, well, let's have church vouchers here. Well, no, we want a separation of church and state, get government out of religion. And in the early days, the voucher proponents were saying, oh, well, this will lead to the separation of school and state, but it doesn't. It actually embeds the state more deeply into the process because it puts private schools on the voucher dole. And what is the possibility that any private school that expands operations, build new school buildings, hires new teachers is going to say, okay, time to end our dole? It's not going to happen. And so it's important that we libertarians continue raising people's vision to a higher level. When you're advocating school vouchers, it doesn't raise them to that level. All it does is keep people mired in the belief that you have a public school system, that you need a public school system, and it's just a question of how to reform it. What you and I are advocating is something completely different, Richard, something at a higher level, and that's liberty.
Yeah, I'll just mention that a good number of years ago, I did a piece which appeared on the FFF website, which was a satire. Gary Becker, who was an excellent free market economist, University of Chicago Nobel Prize winner, had written a piece in defense of vouchers. And then I wrote a satire play off on it. Imagine if there were people who were concerned about the quality of moral education in America. And therefore, we were going to try to make it better through a voucher system for churches and where you could go to church and how you would go to church. And I did an entire satire of how it would undermine and destroy, ultimately, both the spirit of toleration and the practice of separating religion from the state. Once you politicize it, even with vouchers for morality for church attendance, it would destroy the very purpose of advancing some type of notion of a moral and ethics standard in the society. I actually don't even remember the title of the article I used, since it was a good number of years ago, but it is somewhere on the FFF website. And I just tried to show the reductio ad absurdum of the premise when you took it from schooling to ethical training through church vouchers.
All right, so I would recommend that people just Google Ebeling vouchers, fff.org, and I'm sure you'll be able to find it. All right, Richard, on that note, we'll wrap things up. If you're new to FFF, come to visit us at fff.org for 33 years of principled arguments like the one you're hearing today at Libertarian Angle on all aspects of the libertarian philosophy. And subscribe to our FFF Daily, which we've tried for, more than 20 years, I think, to make the best libertarian commentary page on the internet. We send that out 6 days a week. We got a great monthly journal. We got great presentations on YouTube. You can go to our multimedia section of our website and see all the great conferences we had. I've got a brand new series starting on the JFK assassination 60 years later. This is the 60th anniversary. I think we've published 3, maybe 4 segments, and it's a continuing series. So we'd love to have you join us. And if you haven't yet donated to the Future of Freedom Foundation, we'd love to have you support our work. Richard, on that note, we'll wrap things up, and enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to talking next week, and thank everybody for tuning in.
Until next time.